Welcome everyone, and welcome to the final session of the 2-week A4S Summit 2020. It has been really great to have all of the various discussions. We've had a lot of different perspectives, a lot of speakers, and today, as you all know, we've been focusing on reporting. And I couldn't be joined by somebody better to both close the summit and to share insights into the world of reporting than today's final speaker, Russel Picot. Russel is currently chair of the trustee board of the HSBC UK Pension Fund, a former director of LifeSite, Willis Towers Watson's UK DC Master Trust Board, where he chaired the Audit and Risk Committee. Prior to that, he was at HSBC as Group Chief Accounting Officer, so has first-hand experience of what it means to prepare reporting, and co-chair of the FSB's Enhanced Disclosure Task Force, special advisor to the FSB TCFD, and a whole raft of other activities, Russel, which would probably take up the rest of the half hour that we have to conclude the discussion. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for inviting me. Great pleasure to be here to be able to talk to you about these important issues. Thank you.
Great. Well, Russel, I would like to kick off. We've heard over the course of the day today from the regulatory perspective with Ashley and Alder and IOSCO. We've heard about the European developments, IFRS Foundation developments from GRI and SASB's chair and CEO. And then earlier today from Hiro Mizuno from the investment perspective. And it's there with that investor need that I would like to start. So could you say a little bit about what you see? You've been involved in that pensions world, but also a number of other activities that give you insight in that area.
So I think, Jessica, if you look at the spectrum of what investors use information for, you've got at one end investors who only focus on financial matters, and at the other end you've got philanthropic investors or people who basically give money away. But along that continuum, you'll have a range of different investor perspectives. So you'll have investors who use ESG information, for example, to improve risk-adjusted return for their members. You'll have thematic investing, impact investing that's very laser-like focused on particular outcomes. And you'll have investors who are looking at the ESG landscape, thinking about systemic risk and seeking to manage those risks. And a lot of consideration around engagement, trying to change corporate behavior to get a better system, either because they believe for the planet and people that's important, but also very strongly also linked to better financial outcomes.
And one of the things that you do as part of A4S's work is act as co-chair of our Asset Owners Network. In the UK, the pensions regulator is planning to require TCFD, so the Task Force for Climate-Related and Financial Disclosures, so that pension funds have to disclose around the TCFD requirements, and that clearly will also drive a demand for disclosures along the whole investment chain. Can you say a little bit about what that might mean, how pension funds can respond, and then how that will indeed drive others, asset managers, companies, to be disclosing in this area?
Sure. I mean, clearly one of the most important things that TCFD stated is that climate change risk is a financial risk, and it's basically present in all asset classes and in all portfolios. And as you say, in the UK, large pension schemes are going to be required to report under TCFD. Some are already doing it, but many are not. So that is going to change conversations in some trustee boardrooms. They're going to have to think about how they manage climate change risk, what choices they make, what investment strategies they should use, and then communicate that to their beneficiaries. And of course, as you said, Jessica, at the heart of the TCFD is the concept of the investment chain. The end investors needing this information to manage their portfolios and demanding that information from the companies in which they're invested. And this will further drive the pressure on the corporate world to make these disclosures. Clearly, at some point, because TCFD is a voluntary regime, it either is so important it needs to be hard-coded in standards or made mandatory, or it should fall by the wayside. As you know, I passionately believe TCFD is so important. We need to get to a place where it's actually part of the normal reporting landscape.
And certainly, if I think all of the companies and others, pension schemes and fund managers, there's clearly internal benefits that you derive from adopting
Absolutely.
that. It reminds me very much of the principles of integrated reporting. So it's almost a lens of how the organisation is managing and understanding the risks and the opportunities, rather than it purely being about disclosure. Clearly, it's communicating that to the outside world.
Absolutely, yeah.
One of the things that has come through from today's discussion, and when you talked about that investor spectrum, I think this comes to mind, and it's that whole thorny question of materiality. The term double materiality has come up. That's clearly something the EU is talking about. Dynamic materiality. Can you say a little bit about what that means for an investor perspective? You mentioned the link between climate and financial. But how would you, as an investor, see that whole question?
Yeah, I think this is a critical question for the whole IFRS Foundation trustee consultation, actually. So I think my perspective is that one of the things that, well, starting with integrated reporting and then the TCFD really following that, was top down. So seeking to understand the impact on a company's business model and strategy of an external factor, like climate change, but not uniquely climate change. And I think that's the starting point for investors' interest. It sets the context for understanding the risks and opportunities within a business and what action that management in that company may be taking. So for me, that's absolutely critical. Clearly, you do need to have reporting of appropriate metrics, but that top-down approach, I think, is fundamental. Now, I think increasingly there's understanding that you can't easily disentangle the impact of the environment on a company and its long-term value creation capability and the impact of that company on the environment. Frankly, I think they're quite difficult to disentangle. Climate change is a very good example. We ask companies to report the greenhouse gas emissions. That's clearly an impact which they're having on the outside world. Why? Because that gives a sense of how much they're going to have to change as we drive to a net zero global economy. It also gives a sense of their susceptibility to policy change. So I think both of those, the outside in and the inside out perspective, are really important. The question is, on the inside out, how far do you go in terms of the topics, the sustainability topics that you then bring into some sort of standard setting regime? I mean, I don't think we're that far away, maybe a year or two, from the discussion we're currently seeing on nature and biodiversity, which we're seeing emerging with economic studies, etc., increasing investment appetite, starting to be the next series of issues that gets reflected.
Yeah, and that was definitely something we were touching on during the Nature Day last week. We've had a few questions around the robustness and reliability of information. So most information in the ESG realm is not necessarily externally assured. So what role do you think regulators can play, or investors indeed, in terms of making sure that the information that they have is reliable?
I mean, I think the critical point is you probably do need standards, as we have in financial reporting. Standards to make sure you have consistency across companies and to provide basic rules. I think that without standards, it's quite difficult for regulators to police the environment and investors to do that by themselves. There is a risk. I think this is quite a concern, that there are substantial gaps in data at the moment, that cherry picking is something that is quite difficult to rule out, and particularly, for example, with the Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of corporate reporting which is attaching benefits to their activities by picking particular SDGs. What it's not doing is being even-handed and actually faithfully reflecting the negative impacts. So I think, first of all, we need standards, then we need to have management giving that information the same degree of process and assurance as financial reporting information. That's what TCFD asks for. I think we ought to consider external assurance around both the process and those data elements. That, I think, is the sort of the complete package that then gives investors and regulators the confidence that the system has been designed with solid foundations. And
in terms of that question of coming back to then the TCFD, one of the things that has recently in development is the TNFD.
Yep.
So focused on nature rather than climate. Yep. Do you think the same kind of approach and thinking will work? How do you fast track that understanding of nature, which of course, again, when you look at biodiversity risk, the systemic risk that a collapse in biodiversity poses, how do we accelerate the availability and use of information in that area?
Yeah, I think this is both a very interesting area, Jessica, and a very important area. And if you think back 5 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about climate change in the business community in the way that we do now. And actually what's happened in that period is, well, first of all, we had the Paris Agreement, which was a game changer, TCFD, but also that I think the general understanding of climate change risk, it being a financial risk, and the impact on business models and strategies and on the investment community, that knowledge has grown from a low level to an encouraging level. We also have managed to boil down climate change risk into sort of two numbers: greenhouse gas emissions and global temperature increase. Now, if you look at nature, I think nature is probably where we were 5 years ago. It's not really a subject of a lot of discussion within the business and investment community right now. We don't have the same degree of understanding, and we don't have the same metrics that we all could talk about. I actually think conceptually, something like biodiversity is much harder to address than climate change, because I think the metrics are potentially more diffuse and perhaps more national or regional. But that's not to say it isn't a serious issue. I think in the vanguard of investor thought, there is some concern around the impact on long-term investment outcomes. You mentioned that I think Hero has spoken on this, obviously, in his previous role. Universal ownership was a critical component of what his pension funded, and obviously his universal ownership is an important concept of trying to influence better outcomes by trying to make sure that these environmental impacts are managed.
Now, one of the other questions which links to something I'd like to dig into a little bit as well is around how do you avoid disclosure becoming a tick box exercise and really failing to provide that value creation narrative, which really is captured by integrated reporting. And linked to that, something that we've seen then specifically around climate, but it could apply to the conversation we were just having then around nature and indeed other areas, is really people disclosing their transition pathway as well. The dialogue around how management are setting ambitious targets and achieving them at that strategic risk level, not just the data, which is important in terms of understanding and tracking progress, but is only one part of the puzzle.
Yeah, so I think the structure of TCFD is a very good way of tackling that, because first of all, it looks at governance and then strategy and then risk management. I think any regime that simply lifts and drops a whole series of metrics doesn't deliver the sort of change, because obviously one of the things that you referred to earlier is that this is partly about driving different conversations in the boardrooms, and that top-down approach absolutely provides that, and requiring that to be reported on by management, I think, is critical, together with the right metric. Now,
one of the areas we haven't touched on so far, and I'm hoping you can still hear us, Russell. I think it's that time of day in the UK where we're getting higher demand on our broadband. So is around, of course, we've talked about climate, we've talked about nature, some of those environmental issues. Sustainability at its core is also about people, and some of the human capital, social capital dimensions over the last year in the context of the pandemic. I think we've collectively seen the heightened awareness, heightened importance and focus on some of those issues, whether it is diversity, inclusion across the whole organisation, or the impact that an organisation has to support and protect its workers and communities. Can you say a little bit more about how that fits into this whole conversation, particularly thinking of the A4S Foundation consultation? They're asking whether they should look at climate first and then move on to other issues. Can that really work?
Yeah, I think the climate first approach, I think, Jessica, is somewhat pragmatic. As you know, TCFD is a voluntary private initiative, and it doesn't have a permanent home, and we need to give TCFD a permanent home. So it's it's also the most developed of all these areas, and it's right now a hot topic both for business and investors. I think these other components are seen as being important parts of well-run companies. And I think then the question is, do all of those topics sit within global sustainability standards, or does some of those topics fit outside that and are subject to national or regional requirements? And I think that is a really important debate and discussion yet to happen with the foundation. My own perspective is, I think doing climate first is the right thing, but I would also then make sure that we have a clear framework for how we would write future sustainability standards, so that there is confidence in the business investor community of the structure, because you don't really want there to be a sort of bespoke structure created every time a new sustainability issue gets addressed. So I think that framework is critically important for me.
I think we've probably got time for one, possibly two more questions. So the first one, coming back to that whole point of a pension fund, and I think this isn't just pension funds, it's probably equally true for smaller and medium-sized companies, and possibly even those at the larger end, or the smaller end of large, the larger end of medium, around how you can actually go about disclosing whether it is TCFD or more broadly, without big resources and deep expertise in this area. So what are a few top tips to get going?
And for me, it's about not boiling the ocean dry for enterprises like that, because I think the starting point has to be the conversation in the boardroom. And I think one of the things that is important is to use a through the eyes of management approach. So have those conversations. Does your board actually understand climate change risk and its impact? Without that, you can't really make appropriate disclosures. So first of all, that conversation, make sure you've got someone who can help your board and support your board in that conversation and its journey, and move along that spectrum as you can. Sorry about my internet, Jessica. I keep on the screen, so hopefully you can see him.
I think we're getting most of the words, if not your full expression, Russell. So, but I think the words are the thing that's key. So I'm going to ask you just one final question, and it is around the next year ahead. So this time next year, we usually host our A4S Summit every year. Next year we also have COP26, of course, being hosted in Glasgow. What would your hope be for the reporting landscape? What will it look like in 1 year if you could wave your magic wand and have what you wanted?
Okay. We would have a new global standard for climate change reporting. We would have a framework for governing sustainability reporting. We would have a host of commitments made for COP26, and we would see meaningful discussion around nature and biodiversity loss as being important business and investor issues for discussion.
And how likely is it? What can everyone listening here do to make that a reality?
So my encouragement is to get on the pitch and play in the game, Jessica, to make your voice be heard. These aren't subjects just to be left to the accountants, important though they are. Make sure that your voice is heard, particularly by the IFRS Foundation trustees. They are really open to hearing from a broad range of users, and hopefully they will come to a good outcome and we'll be able to support them in this really important work.
And people have until the 31st of December to do so. So thank you very much, Russell. That was
My pleasure.
We managed to cover quite a lot in a short amount of time. But I just to underline Russell's last point there, I think that there are opportunities for everyone, both if you haven't already, and I hope that you have as a preparer or indeed as an investor. Make sure that you are keeping up to date with this agenda. You are seeing that shift to either being asked for the information by investors and other stakeholders. It is heading towards that mandatory zone in many jurisdictions, and the earlier that you've really started to develop what you do, the better. And to learn as you go. Do make sure that the information you're preparing is meaningful. Use it for decisions internally. That point around integrated reporting gives a really good framework to get started. So I would like to now just thank everyone for participating in this year's A4S Summit, to all of our speakers, everyone who's joined the dialogue and the different discussions that we've had over the 2 weeks. We will be sharing with everyone summaries that have come out of those discussions. All of the content is available on playback in the Summit site until mid-January, and we'll also be making it available to those who couldn't join for the Summit on our other channels. So thank you very much for joining us, and we will look forward to connecting again soon. Thank you.